Sonja Borgmann, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, you know what? Let's start out at the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Seattle, Washington, with two sisters and my parents.
Okay. What do your parents do for a living?
My mom is an artist and my dad works in construction.
Okay.
So I grew up
So
in a very artistic household.
I was just gonna say there's a creative thing going on there, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of creative elements and work with our hands and a lot of storytelling and creating of art in my
Ah,
childhood.
gotcha. So did you have an interest in like investigative journalism when you were young?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I was thinking about this when you were asking if I was watching documentaries when I was little, and
Yeah.
a lot of the films that I watched when I was younger were international narrative films, so less so on the documentary side, more narrative focused. But I definitely, my mom is a big storyteller and absolutely like loves digging into human stories. So growing up, I was always hearing stories from her and got very interested into kind of the human side of storytelling from a young age. But I first fell in love with kind of videography and camera work, partially through watching those films, and then as well, my grandfather was a chemist at Kodak, and so growing up,
Oh,
he was always making home videos of us and
yeah.
filming us. So I was around camera work a lot growing up, and once I got to the age where I was no longer annoyed to be filmed, I was very interested in picking up the camera myself.
Wow. So when everybody else was watching Barney, you were watching some international whatever.
A combination of that and a lot of musicals.
Okay, cool. So why did your parents think of this like creative side that you had that you were kind of like jumping out to?
Pardon, what did they think of it?
Yeah, what did your parents think of, your creativity, you wanting to go into all this kind of stuff?
My parents were incredibly supportive of it since both of them have a very like artistic background. Again, like I remember the very first camera back in the day, my mom had, film photography camera. I remember her photographing us on as kids. But when we first got our little family, like first digital camera, that's what I started picking up to film little videos of my sisters and everything. But my parents were very supportive of my desire to use the medium of film to tell stories, to have my own creative license. They helped kind of seek out opportunities for me to gain more film experience. And the first time I had an opportunity to investigate like documentary film and not just my own creative little tales that I was filming with my sisters was with a documentary film company down in Oregon. I was still very early in my high school years, and there was a company down in Oregon that worked with the Oregon Museum of Science, and they were teaching kids how to produce documentaries. So I was part of a little crew down there, and we worked on this film about tsunamis. But it was one of my first experiences getting to tell nonfiction storytelling
Mhm.
and having an understanding of how to put together those stories. And I loved it.
How cool is that? I mean, that's quite the opportunity for a high school kid. Did that really kind of jumpstart your interest in all this?
It absolutely did because it was the first time where I really got an understanding of the writing and research process that went into documentary filmmaking. And again, from growing up and being around so many stories and being exposed to some international storytelling, I just loved getting to know people through their life stories. And on this little documentary that we made, we were interviewing survivors from a couple of the tsunamis that passed through Crescent City, California.
Oh, wow.
So it was an opportunity where I got to equipment, but then also from the producing side, understanding how to draw out these stories, how to find who you want to interview to tell these stories. So we had a couple of different survivors as well as experts in the area who were taking earth core samples to understand the history of tsunamis in the area. But definitely, yeah, this film campus was my start to really falling in love with the documentary film genre.
That's really heavy stuff for a high school kid. It's like you haven't matured yet, and yet you're dealing with some pretty serious, heavy stuff. That's very cool. So I'm guessing this was a springboard for college. What did your college years look like?
Yeah, it was definitely a springboard for college. So while I was kind of gaining some of those technical film skills at this point, kind of early high school years was the first time I was starting to learn another language, and I was learning Spanish. And the experiences that I had with that language made me very interested in using language to be able to connect to other people in Spanish speaking countries, in Guatemala as well as Spain. I went to a public high school in Spain for one of my semesters of high school, and it was during these experiences I was using my newfound language skills that were very rocky at
Yeah,
the time to start to understand people's political and cultural backgrounds and stories, and to kind of ask a lot of questions about the different ways that they thought about things, their different cultural experiences, and starting to have these threads of interest in international relations and in cross-cultural storytelling and kind of sharing across cultures. So having this passion for documentary filmmaking, as well as my worldview starting to expand outside of the United States, those passions kind of came together for me when I was choosing where to go for college, and realizing that I really wanted to be able to study international relations, but also to be able to hone my skills for filmmaking as a medium to tell stories that
sure.
I was learning about from building relationships with people outside of the US.
Were you self-conscious or self-aware that when you were talking to all these people that, it wasn't just a conversation? All of a sudden, did you kind of find yourself slipping into interview mode instead of just like normal conversations? Did that happen to you?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like at that age, I was so young that it was still very conversational,
Yeah.
but something that comes very natural to me is question asking. So I
Yes.
never thought very hard about that. My mom is a huge question asker, and I feel like growing up, I just kind of learned to have a curiosity for people
Right.
from that, and my questions came. Of course, at this point, they were like in broken Spanish, but my curiosity for understanding people's stories and kind of how they became who they are, or how they thought about the things that they did and what informed those perspectives that they had,
Yeah.
that
So
I just naturally was asking them a lot of questions.
yeah, you're a good interviewer. We'll touch on this a little bit later on, but I've been interviewed by a lot of different people, and you're probably one of the top ones. You have a very you're very professional, but a very laid back way about you. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's perfect for, interviewing somebody, I think.
Oh, thank you. Well, you gave an excellent interview. It helps to, as I, listen into your podcast, you have such a conversational flow. And I think I've learned that that's something that really assists in interviewing, especially in the true crime
Oh
world,
yeah.
or when interviewing about very heavy topics,
Yes,
just to kind of
absolutely.
connect
Absolutely.
on a human level.
So when you became interested in foreign affairs, it took you to Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, Berlin, and Lisbon. You wrote stories for Frontline PBS and Balkan Insight. How did you get these jobs, and how did this mold you into producing documentaries today?
Yeah, that's such. So again, when I went off to college and I was interested in documentary film and kind of falling in love with international relations, and I was very curious to broaden my worldview, to have another international experience. The Balkans was a region that I knew almost nothing about.
Okay.
And I will say that there's definitely been kind of role models who have influenced the shifts that I've made in my career as I've gone. But one of my first introductions to the region was through a book written by the former UN ambassador under the Obama administration. So Samantha Power had been not that much older than I during college when she left an internship in DC to go become a war correspondent in Bosnia and Herzegovina when the
Wow.
wars of the 90s were going on there.
Yeah.
So I was reading her work and just absolutely inspired by her confidence and her determination at such a young age to be covering these wars. And she was situated in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which I later lived in when I was there reporting on a story during college. And, at that point, Sarajevo was under siege, and it's basically the town is in the valley, so there's these mountains surrounding them, and there are snipers up in the mountains during the years that Sarajevo was under siege. So journalists down there, including Samantha Power, they're like running between these buildings and ducking for
Yeah.
cover as snipers are shooting, but that's how they were doing their work. And I was really inspired by the determination she had for being there and reporting on the wars happening and basically giving witness to the tragedies, but also the complications of the conflicts,
Hmm.
the complexity of the conflicts unfolding around her. So her work really inspired me, and I was really drawn to learn more about the region because the wars ended kind of before, um, as I was still young.
Yeah.
So I didn't like live through taking in all of the media about what's happening over there. So it was a region that I didn't know very much about. I had a lot of interest in that. But the other thing that I was really hoping to gain was journalism skills,
Hmm.
and on the ground reporting skills. And so there's a fantastic opportunity that's run by SIT for college students to basically work and train under seasoned journalists from the region who grew up there, who
Mm.
lived through the wars, reported on the wars. Um, so it was a journalism program as well as historical classes in understanding what led to the wars of the 90s, how the breakup of Yugoslavia impacted the region, and then to have reporting experience on the ground, reporting on kind of contemporary stories
Sure.
in Serbia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina on what the region looks like now post the breakup of Yugoslavia.
Okay.
So that's what I was there to do.
So you cut your documentary teeth doing that. Um, where did you get your interest in criminal justice? More specifically, like true crime cases. Where did that come from?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, can we talk a little bit about some of the reporting in the Balkans
Absolutely.
or yeah, okay. Well, I wanted to say, kind of a few things because I'm learning about while I was over there, I was getting a better understanding of the wars and the different massacres that happened during them. One of the things that I was reporting on over there that really caught my interest was understanding how the youth of the countries in post Yugoslavia, what their experiences growing up after the wars were, because
Hmm.
basically these young students in Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina were growing up hearing stories from their parents about the wars that had just unfolded, inheriting, I would say, some kind of generational traumas from that, but also not really having experiences of meeting youth from the other countries that used to be part of Yugoslavia.
Okay.
There's kind of divisions there. So I was reporting on this group of youth who were brought together by film festivals in these three countries
Okay.
who they were building relationships between these youth and having them basically be on a youth film jury. So there's quite a happening film scene in the Balkans, that there's film festivals in each of these countries
Yeah.
throughout the year. So these students were traveling and meeting each other for the first time after
Yeah.
never having crossed the borders across these countries. So I was meeting with them and kind of understanding some of the coming of age experiences that they were sharing with their peers. And I thought it was really powerful because at the end of the program, some of these students were talking about how they were looking forward to visiting each other and one another's hometowns and hopefully working together in the future in the film industry. And I think these stories kind of go back to the types of cross-cultural sharing that I've been so interested in because without having the opportunity for them to meet each other in person, what they were really learning about each other was through the media narratives that could have often been very one-sided
Hmm.
in the media that they're consuming in their countries. So I had a lot of interest in that. And after kind of finishing that program, how I ended up gaining my interest in true crime was following the International Tribunal on former Yugoslavia that was unfolding to prosecute the war crimes that had happened
Oh, okay.
during the war of the 90s.
Yeah.
So, kind of in the understanding that I was starting to have for the difficulties around prosecuting war crimes, which is a very similar thread to prosecuting the domestic homicides that I cover now, is just the key of documentation and needing to document and have evidence to be able to prosecute international war crimes. There's many families in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Croatia who still don't know where their loved ones are buried. Those bodies have not been found to this day, and I mean it's been over 2 decades now, 2.5 decades now. But just some of the challenges around that had piqued my curiosity, and in the domestic homicides I've covered now, the ones that are most challenging to prosecute, pardon me, the ones that are most challenging to prosecute are the no body cases. When you're lacking that information, you're lacking the ability to do an autopsy on the person who was killed. So I was kind of following the coverage of this international tribunal, and Frontline PBS had just come out with a documentary covering Ratko Mladic's prosecution and his conviction for the genocide in Srebrenica. And so I was really drawn to their work. And
Hmm.
oh, sorry, may I keep going?
Yeah, oh, yeah,
Or
absolutely.
did you have another question? Oh,
No,
okay.
no. Oh, sorry about that.
I was drawn to their work, and there is a journalist in Lebanon who has kind of is an expert on the entirety of the Middle East and traveled with the secretaries of the U.S. and as an international correspondent, Kim Gattas, who had first introduced me to Frontline's work, and that's how I found their project on
Mm.
covering Ratko Mladic's trial at the International Tribunal. So I was really drawn to the work. I was so interested to have an understanding of how the justice process was playing out decades after these wars had ended, especially since I just kind of come from the region and had this experience of understanding how relationships continue to be impacted by these conflicts, how the conflicts how resolution for these conflicts when there hasn't been justice brought to all of the victims, or even an understanding of where the victims are buried, where their bodies are.
Right.
Um, so that brought me to Frontline PBS, and I this phenomenal Lebanese journalist helped connect me because she's very um, aware of all of the Middle East coverage that Frontline PBS has done over the years in that region.
Hmm.
So I found my way to interning with Frontline PBS.
Oh, okay. You were still in college?
Yes, I was
Yeah,
still in
okay.
college.
Cool. All right. So you get done with college, you do your internship. Let's fast forward a little bit here. You have produced true crime documentaries on A&E, Tubi, on cases that challenge the American justice system, including the series reboot of American Justice, and features on the infamous convicts like Ted Bundy and the Menendez brothers. What's pulling you towards those types of cases?
Yeah, I think actually one of the first projects I worked on before I even got to A&E was at Frontline PBS, and it was on the Emmett Till cold case investigation. And under this act, they had reopened cold cases from the civil rights era. And essentially, it's all of these cases, different lynchings that happened during the civil rights era where these
Mm,
victims never saw justice for the crimes that were done to them. Either the perpetrators completely walked free, or
yeah,
if they'd even gotten to the point of a trial, that people were not convicted, or perhaps were never even arrested to begin with for the murders that took place. So this project, the focus of it was really to remember the stories of all these victims, understand who they were as people, who they were in their communities, and the importance that they held to all of their loved ones. And it was getting to getting to have an understanding of the importance of this storytelling and the importance of making sure that victims are not forgotten that made me very interested in the balance. I'll touch on this question that your
yeah, sure.
audience member had, but on the balance between, wait one moment. Oh, on the balance between telling the story of a perpetrator and the victim, um, making sure that we are interviewing people who knew the victim closely to get a personal insight into who this person was in all of the important relationships in their lives, who they were to their community, is a focus that I think about in all of my true crime coverage because of there can be a focus often on a sensationalization of the violence that has taken place
Sure.
and a focus on the crimes that the perpetrator committed. And sometimes in that victims, especially in serial killer cases, Ted Bundy comes to mind in this. The Green River killer comes to mind in
Oh yeah,
this. The
BTK.
Grim Sleeper in
Yeah,
California comes
Jeffrey
to mind for this.
Dahmer. Yeah, oh yeah, there's a
Jeffrey
bunch.
Dahmer.
Yeah.
There's so many that once they have such a long list of victims or victims that they're still trying to prove are tied to this perpetrator, the perpetrator kind of comes to the forefront of that storytelling. And sometimes those victims, their names, who they are as people, could be lost in the storytelling. So when I'm approaching those cases, and particularly serial killer cases, making sure we have the involvement of friends and family, making sure that we're hearing their story, sharing their photos, sharing their names, helping them be remembered not just as a body, is really important. And the other piece of it that I was really drawn to, and is why I kind of found my way from the unresolved project that Frontline PBS was doing, that was remembering all of these victims from the civil rights era, to my first show on A&E, was the thread of understanding the American criminal justice system. There is so much to learn about the process that just of how justice is unfolding in the United States, and having had some kind of questions about the way that justice was pursued in other countries, I started to have, more questions about how cases were prosecuted in the United States, what that process looked like. So American Justice, the reboot of American Justice that I worked on at A&E, the focus of the onset of that show was to really show cases that challenged the American criminal justice system, where either prosecutors were up against a difficulty in prosecuting a case where there was no legal precedent. I think about the Michelle Carter case out of Boston, where Comrade Roy had committed suicide, and his girlfriend had been found to have encouraged this suicide, had been
Hmm.
on the phone with him while he was in the truck committing suicide. But there was no legal precedent for whether or not that is considered committing murder, since she was not the one, she
Yeah.
wasn't physically present and wasn't there, pulling the trigger,
Right.
but
But
was very involved in kind of the
yeah.
psychology of his decisions. So cases like that,
Yeah.
cases like Roquan
Trying to prove
McDonald,
something like that would be really tough.
yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Um, Cases where there was a gray area. And I think this is something I'm sure you have a much better understanding with your career as a lieutenant, but the difficulties with evidence being not always really straightforward and clean cut. As you and I talked about before with the totality of circumstances, you
Yep.
often don't have like video footage or witness there to say exactly this is how things happened. So being able to build a strong argument um, in the courtroom that brings to light all of
Yeah.
the different evidence that isn't like so clear and cut
And
always.
that's where it takes, teamwork makes the dream work. Yeah. What it is, you need good cops and you need good supervisors, you need good detectives that are going to set the stage, to collect all this evidence and present a very good case. Then you're going to need a prosecutor that has the heart to take on a case that isn't black and white, clear cut. You know, as cops, that was probably one of the most frustrating things was DAs are usually underpaid and overworked, and their job performance was on, okay, are you disposing of this case? And if you go to trial, are you winning this case? So when they agree to take a case, they're like, I'm like 100% sure I could win this case. Not, I'm like 50-50, we'll flip a coin kind of thing. And sometimes life
Mm-hmm.
just isn't that simple, and you need all of those pieces. It just, yeah, sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating when you put all these hours into the work in the investigation. You have witnesses that, that you have kind of prodded along to, they're reluctant witnesses, etc. And you really want to do good by the family and the victim. That's because there's a victim to all these crimes. There's a victim and there's a family of said victim. And you want to do the right thing. And and that's police work 101. And then it goes up to a DA and it could be incredibly frustrating because their burden of proof is different, obviously. They have to prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. Where we just have probable cause to arrest somebody, it's a lower burden of proof. And it can be so frustrating. And that's where there's a lot of conflict between prosecutors and cops. And some of it, you'll have that one DA that will take on almost anything and most of the time win because their heart is in it and they just push through. And then you have other DAs that are
Mhm.
so incredibly lazy, they just cherry pick it and it's like, yeah, no. And they don't think about the family. They don't think about the victim. It's just, oh, yeah,
Mhm.
that really strikes a nerve, for most cops that care
Yeah.
about their cases.
Yeah, that brings up a thought for me, particularly with covering the Menendez case, just watching the relationship that the defense attorney Leslie Abramson had built with the Menendez brothers during that trial. I think it showed so much because the other thing I've been learning about prosecuting these cases is, in addition to the evidence, it's really about crafting a really strong narrative and
Oh
being
yeah.
able to present a very strong narrative argument in the courtroom to the jury. And Leslie Abramson was such a, I think people called her a firecracker in the courtroom, but you could just tell in the way that she was helping the jury to get to know the Menendez brothers and understand kind of the why and the context for the family dynamics that they were surviving in their household before the murder of their parents, why to humanize them, kind of why it led to the murder of their parents. Her defense arguments, and I watched that whole trial. That her defense really stood out to me.
Yeah, if you're an active cop or detective, you're going to be up on the stand quite a bit. And, I remember one time I was newer, it was a very high profile homicide trial. And,
Mm-hmm.
there was cameras all over the place and, it's nerve wracking. And I was up on the stand testifying. It was a little over hour and a half, 2 hours, somewhere in that ballpark. And the prosecutor wasn't the best. I'll leave it at that. The defense
Mm-hmm.
attorney reminded me of Columbo. He was kind of shorter with a big mustache, and he would just like present something, and then he'd be like, "Oh yeah, one more thing." I mean, it was straight out of Columbo, and I'm like, "Oh my God, this guy is hilarious." And the entire time I'm up there, I'm thinking to myself, if I ever get into trouble, I want you representing me. You know, it,
Yeah, yeah.
it's easy for cops to get a really bitter taste in their mouth regarding defense attorneys. But
Mm-hmm.
you have to
Mm-hmm.
remember that it is the system and they have to do their best, to represent their client. Even though if their client's a scumbag, that has done X, Y, and Z, they still have to do their best. But
Yeah,
there's some that are still ethical and can do that. And then there's others that, they do theatrics, they yell and scream and throw stuff around and whatever. And usually a jury could see through that or a judge just stops them.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
for sure. So, oh
yeah. There are some theatrics involved in the
yeah.
courtroom,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
which I
So,
had not realized previously.
excuse me. So I'm, I was looking over some of the stuff that you've done. One thing that really jumped out at me was, I know it's not exactly what you would think I would be interested in, was Killing Diana. That special that you produced. It was it was so shocking to so many. She was a breath of fresh air. Here's a royal that didn't act like a royal. And I think everybody kind of felt bad for her because, Charles was not a nice guy. He treated her like garbage. And the queen did the same thing. She was kind of an outcast and she was there to make babies, to be heirs to the throne, more or less, and she just went through like a living hell. And I really liked the way that special, humanized her and, showed what she was going through and, didn't portray, the Queen and Charles in such a positive light like a lot of other specials have done. it's the truth has come out. So, I'm watching this and I absolutely loved it. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder what you think of this. Did you think she was killed?
Mhm.
Do you think it was an accident or do you think this is a homicide? What do you think, Sonia?
Yeah. I thought this documentary turned out so well, and I have to hats off to all of my producing team who put the show together. I came onto this project towards the end of it.
Okay.
Um, I so many people have asked me this question after this documentary came out, after I had helped produce it. And my first reaction is always no. And I think, or pardon me, yes, that I think it was an accident. I think there is a lot of context around the way that she was treated in the royal family, and she even has her kind of tell-all interview where she's talking about all of the ways where she felt very isolated in the royal family, and
Right.
the way where she felt like kind of her emotional supports and her ability to speak about these things that she was going through, postpartum depression, all of the weight of her marriage falling apart and the affairs happening, that she really didn't have people to confide in. The reason I think that it was that the final way in which she died in the car accident, it felt like an accident to me rather than planned. I think there's just kind of some details around that night that made me feel that it would have been hard to have staged her death in that way.
Mm.
In particular, her driver, her driver had, over he had quite a few drinks before that they had
Oh, the
gotten in
driver
that
did? I didn't
car.
know that.
The driver had quite a few drinks before they had gotten in the car. So was over
You
the
got one
legal
job to do,
driving limit,
driver. One job.
right? One job to protect the princess. So he already was not in probably the most quick reactive time. But
Right.
in addition to that, they were at the hotel and they were trying to go out for a date, but the paparazzi, as they did since basically her time coming onto the scene
Yep.
as a young girl about to marry the prince, they were swarming this hotel. So they didn't have a way out except for through the back. But by the time that they had gotten in the car, like I think that the paparazzi was able to kind of pick up their trail and
Mm.
start chasing them. And from the footage that I watched, from the coverage I watched of all of the cameras kind of taking photographs of the tunnel after they crashed, and of all of the press and tabloid videos that I watched throughout her time in the royal family, I just became very aware of like how persistent the media was in following her, of trying to take photos of her, um, invading her privacy in
Oh, yeah, she had no
some
privacy.
she had no privacy, and I think that that was really exhausting and stressful to her. But the way that they were chasing her down the road, and they went into the tunnel and spun out of control and hit the side of the wall. And I mean, they were going way over the speed limit at this point. So going way over the speed limit and having a driver that was already drunk, it just appeared to me that it really was an accident. Not to say that there weren't poor relationships and feelings between Diana and the royal family, but I just think the way that it happened seems difficult to have staged.
Yeah, you know
But
what?
that's my personal opinion
You're
after watching
right.
this
You're
documentary. And
right.
it's so sad because she had so much grace to her. She was
Right.
larger than life.
She
She had
was.
so much grace. And from such a young age, I just can't even imagine being that young, marrying an older man, and coming into such a public light with no privacy. I mean, she didn't grow up in the royal family. So to have an understanding of kind of what was expected of her, I mean, she just rose to that task and became the people's princess.
Yeah, and that was the thing, she's going to visit, these war-torn countries with, like anti-personnel mines, kids that have their like
Yeah.
legs blown off and stuff, and she's
Yeah.
hugging them. She's going to hospitals with AIDS patients, and she's shaking their hands and she's hugging them. She's actually touching these people, which was unheard of back then. And for a princess to be doing that, that's
Mhm.
amazing. And it just showed that, she had a heart. you
Yeah.
know, and I think she was just so happy to escape, the royal family as much as you could. And then she started having her own life, and then just to be cut down, that young is just, oh my God, it was horrible.
Yeah, it's so tragic. Yeah,
I
she
still,
really changed the barrier that the royal family had in terms of kind of their relationship to their subjects, to the people.
yes.
She reached out to people as human beings. She came to their level.
Yeah, I mean, once everything kind of came to light with what was going on, there wasn't many people that disliked her. Let's just say that. I
Yeah,
think I think the royal family was doing more of damage control, towards the end there. The queen would give like a speech here or there, trying to patch it up a little bit. And I'm like, oh my God, you're doing a terrible job of this. I'm like, oh, you don't believe anything you're reading. It is just like, wow, holy cow. But anyways, but I still think it was a homicide. I maybe I just want to think
yeah,
it is, but because I think she just pissed off the royal family so much by, dating Dodi Fayed, that
yeah.
went totally against their, prim and proper, way of life, et cetera, et cetera. That was totally just that shook the boat. And I think that was like the last straw for the queen mom. But hey, that's just the conspiracy guy in me. I can't prove it. I cannot
Well,
prove
and
it.
there's so many people out there who have that thought as well.
Oh yeah. So I asked you to highlight a couple of cases that you were involved in and kind of give us the quick lowdown because everybody loves a good true crime story. Let's see here. I asked about what? Megan and Marion, Megan Varakis and Marion McDaniel.
Yeah,
Could you kind of give us a little, this is a murder for hire plot. Everybody loves a murder for hire plot.
yeah. Yeah, this case totally caught my attention because not only the murder for hire plot, a murder for hire plot for two people, in addition to a very dangerous sting operation. This case just kind of blew me out of the water. And I think we have, there's a lot of domestic homicides I've covered, um, with women becoming the victim. And in this case, because of the police operation, because of the investigators, daringness to go undercover in the sting operation. They actually saved this woman's life as
Mm,
well as the guy's life. So basically, there's this bail bondsman in Houston who had a former client barge into his door one day. The man was named Leon Jacobs, and Leon came in and he was all upset and frustrated because, as he claimed, he had hired a man to carry out a hit against his ex-girlfriend Megan Veracruz, who he had convinced to move from Pittsburgh down to Houston and start a life with him. Their relationship had had a falling out, and she basically he had been threatening her. And in multiple situations, she had come into, pardon me, let me start that over.
no, that's fine.
Um, he had been threatening her, and she also he had been arrested for stalking her after their relationship ended. But essentially, he's saying, I hired this man to carry out a hit against my ex-girlfriend, and now he's nowhere to be found, and I handed him over money. And this bail bondsman is like, oh my God, like, what are you talking about? So the second Leon leaves, the bail bondsman, Michael Kubosh, picks up his phone. He calls the police. He's like, there's something on your hands that we need assistance with. I think this man is trying to carry out a hit against his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend. So the police are able to basically turn this man that was hired to carry out the hit, which
Mm,
at this point the hit had not been carried out.
yeah.
But the police were able to track down this guy who was going by the name of Zach, and they were able to turn him and have him help them carry out a sting operation. So
Oh,
Zach
wow.
calls
Okay.
Leon and is like, "Hey, you know what? I can't carry out this hit, but I'm going to pass you off to Javier, and Javier is going to
And Javier
finish
was a
the
cop, I'm
business."
guessing.
And Javier is cop.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome.
Javier goes undercover, meets with Leon Jacobs and his now partner Valerie. Oops, one moment.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Valerie again. Okay.
No problem.
Um, so basically, Javier goes undercover and they meet with Leon Jacobs and his now partner, Valerie McDaniel, and Olive Garden, of all places. So they're sitting across the table from each other in Olive Garden, eating breadsticks and basically discussing, kind of beating around the bush, but discussing the fact that they want not only now to kill Megan Farrakis, but as well to knock off the ex-husband, Valerie's ex-husband. So Javier is sitting there like, oh my God, we have two possible murders that they're trying to order from
Yeah.
me. So they basically make a deal. Javier goes away and employs the assistance of both Megan and Mac McDaniel, who's the ex-husband of Valerie, to help them basically pose for pictures to show a faked murder scene and a
Oh,
faked
wow.
kidnapping scene, which let me tell you, for both of them, that was incredibly traumatic experience. Police officers in the process of taking these photos of like Megan bound up as if they had kidnapped her, being
Yeah.
the hitman. She is crying because
Oh,
of
sure.
the trauma, the traumatic nature of this experience. Um, Essentially, Javier then goes back to Leon and meets at their apartment this time. And this is where I just thought it. I just pictured this sting operation unfolding, and I was just like, the daringness of this investigator. He goes up to their seventh floor apartment. He's with them. They walk out to their balcony, seven floors up
Oh,
on the
wow.
concrete. His fellow officers are down on the ground listening to his fire and everything. But they were thinking, like, if anything goes wrong, our ability to get up to the seventh floor quickly enough. Um, this is a very dangerous operation if
Right.
Leon sees through the fact that Javier is wearing a hidden wire, is not actually the hitman he says he is. But Javier, the undercover cop, basically is like, okay, the hit has been carried out on Mac McDaniel. Do you want to see evidence? Do you want to see these photos? The photos they concocted were of Mac McDaniel with pig blood on him,
Oh, wow.
looking like he had been
Hmm.
killed. Leon like was like, no, 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 I don't want to know anything. And they start processing some of the money. And Javier is like, okay, I'll send you photos in a few days when I finish off Megan. So he did. He followed up with these photos that
Wow.
they faked. So essentially, Leon at this point and Valerie are thinking, okay, our exes are knocked off. We don't have to worry about this anymore. We've already paid $20,000 to have them killed. And this hitman, is going to go to the grave with our secrets and we're not um, going to have to know anything or be involved anymore at this point. So
Right.
it's 2, 3 a.m. in the morning. Police officers come knock on their door and basically are trying to, as they're entering the room, they're thinking about delivering the news of Mac McDaniel's death in a way where hopefully this is kind of the last chance for this new couple to give a confession.
Ah,
So
okay.
they come in with the news that Mac McDaniel is dead, and they watch with body cameras the reaction that both Valerie and Leon have. And both Leon and Valerie are like kind of feigning shock, like, oh my gosh, like my ex-husband is dead. How could that be? Leon immediately is like, oh, we were at the house all day. Like we were watching films with your young daughter, like
Yeah.
basically starting to give alibi, even though it hadn't been asked for.
Right.
And the police officers, a few minutes kind of after letting them feign their surprise over
Sure.
this murder, they yell cut and they start reading them their Miranda rights. And so they go off to jail. But it was just understanding the investigative work that it took. And actually, I was curious to ask you because in this, I was kind of pondering at what point how investigators weigh that risk between deciding that they need to carry out a sting operation because of the dangers that put that officer in.
Right. Well, you know what? It's risk versus reward. You wouldn't want to put one of your officers or detectives into like super peril for a shoplifting offense. But this is a big deal. This is, a murder for hire thing. Were these local cops or were they feds or who are they? Do you remember?
Local.
Okay, yeah, depending on the
Interesting.
size of the city, they may not do that very often. That's not an
Mm.
everyday thing, that's for sure. I mean, 25 years, I never came across a murder for hire. I mean, I came across a ton of murders, but for all kinds of different reasons. And we did have contracts put out on cops. Actually, I was in a contract one time, but that's a whole nother story. It's a little unnerving. I won't go into it, but I was advised it's like, yeah, you were at the top of this contract. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh,
And
wow.
it's a very serious twist where it was actually, I'll say it, it was another cop. It was a detective that was very jaded and had some, let's say, mental health issues and
Mhm.
some other issues. And he wrote like this
Yeah.
hit list of all these people that he wanted to kill, and I was at the very top.
How did that make you feel?
At first, I'm just like, really? Man, it made me angry. I'm just like, okay, well, if I see him walking through the front door, there was pictures of him at the district stations of, be on the lookout for, this person. And it's like, oh yeah, I know that guy. I'm on his hit list. But
Oh my
it,
gosh.
so yeah, I mean, it
Well,
all
I'm
got
glad you're still here with us.
yes, yeah, you and me both. But yeah, we've had officers, detectives that were involved in real high level like drug, transactions, drugs, prostitution, guns, you name it. We've had cops go undercover and like I said, murder for hire, more than one cop has been on a hit list and their families. So, obviously I'm very cognizant of that. But going any kind of undercover anything is very dangerous. You never know. But you try to plan it as much as possible, have as much backup. The tropes that you see are, in Hollywood or, movies where you have the lone undercover guy or gal, going into whatever. No, there's going to be backup. You're going to be monitored and there is going to be backup. I would never, ever have people go in, undercover and to do anything if they didn't have any kind of backup. There's no way. There's too much to risk, and it's like, you know what, we'll get them another day. If I don't have the manpower, if I don't have the whatever, then we just don't do it. But yeah, it's again, risk versus reward. This is homicide stuff, so it's big stuff. We're gonna do our best to get them. So
Yeah. And I mean,
that,
in this case, they saved two lives,
yeah, that's amazing. That's
which was really amazing.
yes, yes. So I always ask people who are in your business, why are we so damn interested and obsessed, sometimes obsessed with true crime? What's the fascination? Why do people get so wrapped up in it? What do you think?
There is absolutely an obsession. I think these stories, particularly in the investigative process, they are written for storytelling. Having all of these twists and turns in the investigation, not knowing who did it, that just pulls audiences right through because they want to find out who did it, how did they find this killer, especially when in storytelling and in really compelling storytelling, you want to lay out what the stakes of the story are. Well, in all of these situations, particularly in these homicides or in this murder for hire case, the stakes are really high. You have a person, if not multiple people, in this situation of serial killers who are dead, communities who are traumatized, especially when a killer, like the serial killers that we were discussing earlier, if they keep coming back for more victims, the stakes of not catching who is
Yeah,
perpetrating these crimes is really high.
sure is.
And communities are in fear for their lives.
Yes.
So I think that makes for very compelling storytelling. And in addition to that, yeah, the twists and turns of kind of following how these investigations unfold, the dead ends that they hit, and then hopefully, the turning points in the investigation, whether it's like a tip that they're able to follow up on that gets called in, or a sting operation that they plan. There's a lot of tension and there's a lot of moments that, especially for filmmaking and for documentary filmmaking, um, there's a lot of tension that you're able to build in those moments, and then kind of to pay off later as those turning points lead to further breakthroughs in the
Sure.
case. So I think
Absolutely.
that totally draws viewers in. Like
Well,
you
that's
almost don't want to stop watching until you know what happens.
right. It's like you watch a good, movie or you read a good book and there's that, tension, there's the climax, there's, the bones of the story. And there's a part of you, I think, that it's like, this isn't made up. This is real. And it's like, holy catfish. There's people out there like that. So
Yeah. And
what
sometimes
advice?
truth can be crazier than fiction. Like some of
Oh,
the
all
stories
day
I've
long.
covered,
I
I'm
think
like,
it is.
how could you even make this up?
Yep, I think it is.
Um,
You can't make it up. You can't. I mean,
yeah,
for
yeah.
25 years, I was scratching my head going, did that just happen? It's like, I can't believe it like happened this way. You're just like, wow, this is incredible. But what advice would
It
you
makes,
give? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
oh, I was gonna say it makes me think of your audience members' other question about creative license.
Yeah.
For me, I come from a background in journalism and films that I'm producing. Um, there is entertainment value to these stories. I mean, people are very hooked in listening to them, but I think for me, particularly in the documentary world, having a journalistic lens to producing these stories, since we are producing documentaries, to have those educational components there. We do very vigorous fact checking for all
Mm,
of our films to stay very, very close to the truth, to be leaning into the testimonies of the people who experienced the story, to be leaning into the police and prosecutors
sure. Okay.
evidence and everything. And I
Yeah.
would say there's true crime out there that's able to take a little more of a creative license, but because these TV shows I'm producing are documentaries, we don't wildly go
Yeah.
off track
Okay.
with the story. So I think there's kind of a difference there just in terms of like what the genre is that you're choosing to produce. Because
Sure.
if it is a more narrative film, you're able to take more creative license
Right.
with the
Okay.
direction you take the story in.
So, what advice would you give to someone trying to break into the true crime biz to get your
Yeah.
job? What would you
Yeah.
suggest? How
Having
they
really
prepare?
strong research. Oh, pardon me.
No, I would just say how should they prepare themselves?
Having really strong research and writing skills, I think, are the two things that carry me through the most with producing true crime shows. Um, in terms of breaking into the television industry, this goes for beyond just true crime genre itself, but I would say it's a business that's very word of mouth.
Mm,
My experiences and background in journalism gave me strong research and writing skills that I use every day on my job, but definitely like building those personal relationships was the way that I was able to break into the industry. And it was actually, in finding my way to the American Justice Show, it was what allowed me to do that was honestly kind of cold messaging people on LinkedIn whose different true crime projects I had a lot of interest in that I had watched and found really fascinating. And people were so generous with their time, but kind of reaching out and asking them about their projects and getting an understanding for how they produced them was how I started building some inroads into that genre itself because um, there's there's a huge industry in true crime
okay.
documentary production since there's such a large audience for it.
Yeah.
Um, but definitely research and writing skills. At the end of the day, these are stories. But on the other side of that, I would also say having compassion and empathy,
Mm,
really having an understanding that these are real people's lives that we're dealing with. We're telling stories of real people. There's loved ones who still remember them, who still
yep.
care for them, who still miss them, to not lose sight of that in the production of true crime documentaries.
Interesting. So, with investigating all these true crime cases, it would be easy to become jaded or even paranoid. What do you do to prevent this, or has it happened yet?
It has happened. Oh, it has
Okay.
happened. I have moved to a couple new cities in the last year during my years of producing true crime. And it's so funny because the thoughts that have popped into my head when trying to make new friends in these new cities are not thoughts that I ever would have like considered before producing true crime. But it's suspicion. I feel like I have questions now of like what are people hiding that I maybe didn't come to the forefront of my head as much until producing all of these true crime shows because oftentimes, especially with serial killers who've gotten away with it for so long, it just amazes me. Like, how could they be interacting in their communities and going about their day and putting on a certain charisma that hides like an inner monster? And so I don't know, sometimes, yeah, that suspicion definitely gets to you. The thing that I try and do to help bring myself back down to reality, because you can't live in that suspicion all the time, otherwise you
Right.
have no friends. um, I think trying to remember all of the good stories out there about people that give you hope again, and that a lot of these, especially some of these more horrific cases, that they're more isolated incidences. You know, it's not everybody out there in the world is hiding a monster inside of themselves.
But there are some, and you know it.
But there are some. And I think I used to always assume that I could read people's body language, read whether people were being honest with me. And I think through this true crime, I'm just learning I don't know if I would always be able to tell.
Yeah, some people are, open books. It's like, okay, you could tell right away they're lying or, they're hiding something. But some people are really, really good at throwing you off the scent. I mean, they just have a natural propensity for it,
Yeah,
which is kind of spooky. But hey,
kind of
let's,
spooky.
we're talking about Facebook questions. I'll just kind of buzz through those real quick. I think we've touched on most of them, but Annie Schwartz, my favorite author of the Jeffrey Dahmer book Monster, asked about, how much literary license, do you feel comfortable taking with true crime? And I think you answered that already. You know, these are pretty,
Yeah.
this is documentary style
This
true
is
crime.
documentary style. And I would say it, is different for other genres. Because if you're
Right.
doing a rendition of the story from a more narrative perspective and not from a documented perspective, then you can take more creative license. But for these, we're really fact checking everything, trying to do journalistic due diligence with
Right.
them.
So Catherine Kovacic asks, how do you find and tread the line between telling the story and publicizing, highlighting the perpetrator, while also remaining sensitive to the victims and their families? Now, we touched on that, except for we didn't ask you, how do you find these stories? And how do you like rate them? It's like, okay, this is a good one for what I'm doing right now, or how do you do that?
Yeah. Like, how do we actually find the stories that
Yes.
we want to cover?
Hmm.
Yeah, I would definitely say the stories that by the time they make it to like a documentary film stage, there has been coverage, either whether that's been like published books, published
Hmm.
articles, a podcast, like there's other media formats that have been covering the stories that bring it to our attention and help us start to understand who are the key players in this story, what are the twists and turns in this investigation that might really pique the interest of our audiences. So it's really researching and kind of keeping our um, hand on the pulse of what's happening in the
Okay.
crime world from other reporters
Okay,
that haven't
gotcha.
produced necessarily documentaries before
Right.
about it. Though for some of these infamous serial killers, like everyone
Sure.
has, there's so many docs out there on them. But
Oh yeah.
but definitely that kind of looking to other people's work who are in the crime beat.
Okay, gotcha. Now, Garth Wines or Weens, I'm not exactly sure if I'm pronouncing this right or not. Has anybody that you interviewed or set up for an interview made you feel uncomfortable or unsafe during the interview? And I had a follow-up question to that is, have you ever gone to a prison to interview anybody?
Yeah. So I haven't. My colleagues definitely have. For the prison interviews that I've there, depending on the state that you're in, there are different laws around
Sure.
filming in the prison. So sometimes there's already not a possibility to film an interview. If there is a possibility with no cameras and to get audio recording, we do always try and ask, reach out to the perpetrators, whoever is in prison has been convicted. But so far, in the cases that I have covered, the perpetrator either declined an interview or we weren't able to film in the prisons. That's such a great question, though.
Yeah, it is.
So my colleagues have for sure. I have colleagues who have had experience with that. In terms of if there were any interviews that made me feel uncomfortable, I haven't had that experience. I will say in field producing and interviewing and getting close to the people who were part of these cases, um, there's human beings. So you're always dealing
Sure.
with personalities and particularly people who um, yeah, I will say you're
Yeah.
dealing with different personalities that you have to
Right.
navigate in that process. I have luckily never had an experience of being, uncomfortable, made uncomfortable in an interview. I would say I think that's something we're always doing pre-interviews, kind of building those relationships with our
Mm,
interviewees before we even
okay.
get to being on set with them. So in situations where there have been issues, we've been having those discussions before we even get to set. We've been kind of reading people in our conversations with them before we start filming. So, hopefully those types of situations would be avoided because that pre-relationship that you're building to. So if there was an issue, you'd probably address it before you even got to
Sounds good.
the
Yeah,
set.
I remember when I interviewed Annie Schwartz about the Dahmer stuff, I believe there was one or two times he tried calling her from prison when she was at work. It's like, hey, Annie, Dahmer on line 3, It's like, yeah, that doesn't happen every day. It's like, oh, great, I've got a
Oh,
serial
wow.
killer calling me.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of cool.
That's crazy.
And then
Yeah.
Ann Parker asked, how did she get into her line of work? And I think we covered that.
Yeah.
I think we covered your path to going into this. But by now, some people might be asking themselves, how did we get connected? And I can't say a lot, and I know you can't say a lot because it's a super secret thing that we're doing right now, a project. But Sonja reached out to me, and we did a project together. And like I said, I hate to be a tease, but we really can't talk too much about it. All I could say is that I was very impressed with you and your crew. It was very professional, and you guys treated me like a rock star. It was a great
Oh,
experience.
great.
It was awesome.
Well, you were a rock star. You were a rock star. So yeah, there will be a documentary coming out next year on Tubi
On Tubi
to look out
TV.
for.
All right, and
Tubi TV.
I will keep everybody appraised of the situation. And do we know when? Probably like fall or summer?
Probably early fall. Yeah, but I'll follow up with you when we have a confirmed date.
Outstanding. All right, let's wrap this up. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where do they go?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a website that I can share with you.
Sure.
Do you want me to just say the
Yeah, what is
URL
it?
or? Oh,
SonjaBorgmann.com
yeah.
or
Yeah, I have a website with my different journalism work as well as the TV docs that I produced. It's sonjaborgmann.wixsite.com
okay.
slash portfolio.
All righty. I will put that in the show notes.
Awesome. Thanks.
Very
Yeah, people
good.
might have trouble spelling my name.
Well, you're a very good storyteller and you got the journalism chops. So I got to ask you, when's the novel coming out? Come on.
Soon.
You would be a perfect author for some true crime writing here or even fiction. Do you have
Thank
any inclination to
you.
go that direction?
I would love to. I really do love the writing process of producing documentary films. So to be able to produce a longer piece of written work would be awesome because I've loved even just, producing journalism written pieces.
See,
So yeah, my next big project in the meantime, which I'm still kind of at the early research stages here, but is building a YouTube channel for different international travel stories that are again
mm,
kind of going back to my love for cross-cultural storytelling.
yeah,
So that's my next personal project,
perfect.
but a novel after that.
I
I'll
think you
keep you
should.
apprised.
That's what I'm thinking. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Sonja. It was great.
Patrick, thank you. This has been so much fun.